Hello and welcome. I am Vlad, and this is a video series where I take a photo from raw file to final edit inside of Lightroom so people can learn from my Lightroom editing workflow. Today, before jumping into Lightroom, I have a bit of a controversial take. We don't need more details in the shadows, but I'll explain that as I edit today's photo. I'm inside of Lightroom and this is the photo as it came out of the camera with a really wacky white balance, but that can be fixed with one click of the eyedropper on the gray background. And first order of business is getting a much better crop that's Instagram friendly, because of course we're posting this to social media, and cropping in tighter because I'm the subject of the photo and not the gray background above me. And let's do a bit more house cleaning. I'm gonna be using the remove tool to get rid of my lights that were in shot. That's probably my fault. And before I start with the basic adjustments, I'm also going to enable the remove chromatic aberration and the enable camera profile correction, so Lightroom will automatically get rid of some of my vignetting and the lens distortion. Even though the lens distortion for my Nikon 50mm lens, it's not that much. And you can see it here. If I turn it off completely, you're not seeing much of a difference, but I still like to have that enabled. And now let's go to the controversial part. If you check out the histogram on this photo, you're gonna assume that the photo is underexposed. But as you can probably tell, the photo is not underexposed, and even more, this part over here on my shoulder is rather overexposed. The histogram is just showing that I'm dressed in black, I'm covering roughly a third of the frame, my background is kinda dark as well, and also my beard and my hair are dark as well. So no, the photo is not underexposed massively as you might be tempted to think by looking just at the histogram. And since I'm dressed in black, let's see what happens if I raise the details in the shadows. I'm gonna boost it to plus 100 just for demonstration purposes. And generally, you shouldn't raise your shadows by 100, but that's another story. And in my photo, because of that, you can now see a ton of details in my dark clothes. And the photo, it's not really about the clothes. You can see my nipple over here, and we're losing all the nice contrast on the background behind of me. So let's reset the shadows, and instead, because I want to raise the level of the photo just a tiny bit, I'm gonna use the black slider, and I'm gonna bump it up to something like plus 40. This way, I'm not messing up the contrast ratio between the shadows and the midtones by pushing my shadows into the midtones, but I'm still getting some more details out of my raw file. I'm also going to reduce the highlights just a bit and increase the white point significantly to get more contrast, but I'm going to pay attention to this area over here that's easily blown out if I push it too far. And we're going to address that with a mask in a few seconds. But first, I want to check the white balance that we set in the beginning of the video. I'm going to do that by boosting both vibrance and saturation to 100%, and now I can clearly see that the warm white that I had on myself is also spilling onto the background. So I'm going to come in here and reduce the temperature just a tiny bit, enough so we don't see it on the background anymore. And because there is some magenta into the shadows from my LED lights being kinda wacky, I'm going to add some green into my shadows to compensate for that. Now I can reset the vibrance and saturation back to 0 and I have a much better white balance. And with that said, let's finally fix the local adjustments. I'm gonna enable my Visual Helper, which is a tool that turns the image black and white without affecting anything in the image, and you can find that on my website. And the first thing that I'm gonna do is create a mask, radial gradient, and I'm going to select the shoulder over here. This mask is gonna be intersected with a select subject mask, so I don't affect the background. And now I wanna reduce the highlights in the area, while also increasing the white just a tiny bit, and also reduce the contrast just a bit so it matches the rest of my arm. Now to create a bit more interest into the photo, I'm also going to add a few more radial gradients. First of all, one in front of my face, and this one is gonna be exposure minus 50 something, but from it I'm subtracting the subject. And also I'm gonna add one more on the other side of my head, over here, where I'm going to add a bit of light. And I'm gonna try and keep it subtle. I'm gonna make the mask smaller and place it right behind my head over here, but a bit taller and a bit smaller. What I'm trying to create is alternating zones of lights and shadow. So we're starting with shadow in front of my face, highlights on my face, shadows on my face, and then highlights behind my head. This way, my face will stand out from the background, and the same way happens behind my head, where my dark hair is gonna stand out from the background a lot more if the background is a bit lighter. And another thing that I really wanna do is bring back the vignetting on this side of the photo. So I'm gonna create one more radial gradient. This time I'm gonna make it really large. I'm going to invert it, make it even larger because all I want is to affect that upper right corner, and subtract from it a linear gradient so it doesn't affect the rest of the image. Over here, I want to increase the contrast and decrease the exposure just enough to bring back the sense of vignetting that we had there before. Now I'm going to turn off the Visual Helper and toggle the mask on and off to see what we achieved with just those simple masks. And we can see that on this upper left corner, the image is a bit blue. So in this mask over here, I'm going to also add a bit of color temperature just to compensate for that. Again, I'm gonna try and keep it subtle as I want the image to still look kinda neutral because I'm gonna color grade it later. And I'm also going to use one of these masks to add a bit of warmth to this shoulder over here that still looks a bit out of place compared to the rest of my skin. Not too much, and I'm also increasing the contrast just a tiny bit more to make it blend in better. Maybe a bit of magenta as well. And now let's circle back to my controversial take. We don't need more details in our shadows all the time. And right now, in this photo, you see a bit too much of my pants. You don't need to see all this texture over here, and it's distracting from the actual subject of the photo. So I'm going to create another mask, another linear gradient, a big one. I'm going to invert it. So I'm using the outside of the circle, and I'm placing it around my face with the bottom part of the photo being all covered by the mask. And in this one, I'm going to use the curve tool over here to lower the exposure on the darker area of the photo, increase the highlights so I don't darken my hand as well. I'm going to raise the black points so I eliminate a lot of my contrast over there. I'm making the mask a bit smaller to cover more of the image. And with all this, what I'm doing is eliminating contrast from that bottom part over here. I'm going to toggle it off again, and you can see all the wrinkles on my pants. And when I turn it on, the contrast in that area is gone because the shadow area in the curves panel is rather horizontal. Horizontal lines equals no contrast, and vertical ones mean high contrast. And that's why the hand is standing out so well against the background, but the crotch area is not so full of details and wrinkles anymore. And I'm also going to turn the Visual Helper on once again and toggle this last mask once again to see how much of an impact it had on our photo. Off and on once again. Now let's turn the Visual Helper off and focus on color grading. And for color, I'm gonna start with one of my color response curves. I know that this is a pretty classy setup, so I'm going to look for a classy film stock. And right off the start, Kodak 200 looks really good, but I'm gonna keep looking because I want a bit of a colder background. Something like this Fuji Superia 200 might be a lot better, but I'm still gonna check out a few more because I know Ektar has also nice green tones. But Ektar 100 also gives me these really cold highlights, and I don't really like them, especially on that shoulder that was a bit problematic to begin with. So I'm gonna stick to Fuji Superia 200, and to explain what just happened, color response curves are my way of emulating film inside of Lightroom in a non-conventional way. I'm extracting some color curves from DaVinci Resolve Labs and importing them into Lightroom as color curves over here, and I have them available on my website as well so people can grab them too. If you want to learn more, there's this video over here that explains it in detail, and the best part is that I'm getting the colors from a vintage film without any of my previous settings or other settings in Lightroom being affected. Just the three curves, and now I can tune the look as I like it because the preset didn't use any of my available resources. So I'm gonna start by trying to tighten together the hues in my skin and the hues on the background. To do that, I'm pushing the reds more into orange and the yellows as well, just a tiny bit, but also I'm gonna skew the orange just a tiny bit towards the right, towards yellow. And for the background, what I'm gonna do is push the saturation of the blues just a tiny bit and also push them towards aqua or cyan just a tiny bit. Let's toggle this on and off. And I think I pushed the reds a bit too far, so let's knock that back because I don't want greenish skin. But that's pretty much it with the HSL. And since I'm emulating film, I also want to apply a bit of grain. And for that, I'm using my all-in-one grain preset that's applying more grain in the highlights and midtones than it is in the shadows. And you can see it in action right now, where on my shirt, there's not a lot of grain, but on the darker side of my face, there's a lot more grain. Exactly how real grain would behave on actual film. And to top it all off, I'm gonna use one more of my special tools. I'm scrolling up here and I'm going to apply a film gate for a 4:5 aspect ratio. I think I'm going with this one, but as you can see, the border is way too dark. So I'm gonna come in here and raise the black point just a tiny bit and the same for the white point because this line is what's creating the border. These film gates are not available on my website, but there are borders, white or black ones, that you can grab on my website as well. There are presets that are based on masking instead of using the old method where you would adjust the transform panel and you could never get black borders in there. And that's the video for today. I wanted to focus this one more on exposure and why we don't always need that many details in our shadows. And I really hope you learned something, especially the way I use Visual Helper to eliminate the colors so they won't distract me while I adjust the luminance value and the zones around my head to create more visual depth in the photo. And one more thing before I go, here's the photo that I started with. Let's crop it, and now let's apply the edit. I hope you like my results, and I'll see you in my next video. Until then, you can keep watching this playlist because I do have a lot more editing videos on this channel. Bye!